Still working from home? My father sneered, swirling his whiskey glass as he surveyed me across the crowded patio. The backyard was buzzing with laughter, string lights dancing over perfectly trimmed hedges and perfectly judgmental relatives. I nodded quietly, my lips curving into a neutral smile just as my phone buzzed in my pocket. I slipped it out and glanced down. Acquisition of Kingswell Industries complete. You now own 100% of your family's company. My pulse didn't spike. I didn't flinch. I simply slid the phone back into my coat and looked up. He had no idea. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, one more chance to belittle the daughter who never lived up to her potential. What they didn't know was that while they were busy mocking me, I had just bought the empire they worshipped. And now, it was mine. Growing up as a Blake meant living inside a gilded cage. Our family name was etched into the bronze plaque outside Kingswell Industries headquarters, engraved into boardroom walls, and whispered in business schools like it was royalty. Founded by my grandfather in 1952, Kingswell started as a small tools manufacturer and grew into a national supplier of industrial systems. It wasn't just a company, it was our family identity. And from the very beginning, I never quite belonged. My father, Charles Blake, was the second-generation CEO, a man who wore authority like a custom suit. Everything about him projected control, his posture, his tone, even his disdain. To him, family was just another extension of business, and I was the underperforming asset. My brother Trevor? Oh, he was everything my father could have hoped for. Captain of the debate team, Wharton MBA, took over the West Coast operations by 27. By 30, he was negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts and being groomed to take the helm. Meanwhile, there was me. I was the creative one, the idealist, the phase that would pass. While Trevor studied supply chains and capital investment, I was drawing blueprints for solar-powered microgrids and pitching circular economy ideas to teachers who didn't quite know what to do with me. At family dinners, my ideas were punchlines. Sustainability might look cute on a college brochure, Dad once told me, slicing into his steak, but in the real world, it's margins that matter. I still remember nodding silently, while Trevor smirked across the table. My mother, Veronica, would give me a sad little smile as if to say, "Don't push it, Madison. Just play along." She was a perfect hostess, graceful, quiet, and always behind my father's right shoulder. I don't think she ever truly believed I could win, only that I could avoid losing too loudly. But I couldn't fake it forever. By the time I turned 20, I had already decided I wouldn't spend my life following a script someone else wrote. Not even if that script came with a corner office and my last name on the door. Kingswell wasn't my destiny, but one day, it would become part of my story. Just not the way they expected. I started asking dangerous questions before I even knew they were dangerous. Why does Kingswell still use fossil fuel-heavy production lines? Why do we spend millions on shareholder gifts and nothing on upgrading worker safety? Why haven't we digitized inventory tracking like our competitors? At first, my father dismissed them with a wave of his hand. Later, he started glaring, and eventually, he just stopped answering altogether. Trevor once leaned in during a family barbecue and said, "Dad says idealism is a luxury. You should try focusing on the real world sometime." I just stared at the flames flickering in the grill and thought, "No, I'm focusing on the future. You're all stuck in the past." I wasn't trying to rebel. I was trying to understand why things couldn't be better. During high school, I built a project on zero-waste factory modeling that won a state-level innovation award. My teachers were thrilled. My father called it a school science fair stunt. Trevor laughed and said, "Cute, but that's not how industrial systems work." Their contempt didn't just hurt, it fueled me. In my senior year, I was accepted into Stanford's environmental engineering program. When I announced it over dinner, the table fell silent. "Stanford?" Dad repeated, like it was a foreign word. "You've always been so strong in communication. Why not business? Why not Wharton like Trevor?" "Because I want to build things," I said. "Sustainable systems, resilient infrastructure, Solutions. He stared at me like I'd insulted him. You think you're smarter than the generations that built Kingswell? I didn't answer. What would have been the point? I packed my bags and left for California with a backpack full of textbooks and a heart full of something I hadn't felt in years: direction. At Stanford, I felt like I could finally breathe. The questions I asked weren't ignored, they were explored. My professors saw potential instead of problems. I met peers who believed the climate crisis wasn't just real, but solvable. And for the first time, I imagined a world where my ideas weren't laughed at, they were funded. One professor, Dr. Elise Grant, became a mentor. She told me, "The reason you see friction at home is because you're not trying to burn the system, you're trying to redesign it. That's always uncomfortable to those who benefit from the old way." I remember standing in her office that afternoon, sunlight hitting the edge of her whiteboard sketches, and realizing, maybe I wasn't broken. Maybe I just didn't belong in their version of success. But I could build my own. And maybe, just maybe, one day they would see the future through my eyes. I started asking dangerous questions before I even knew they were dangerous. Why does Kingswell still use fossil fuel-heavy production lines? Why do we spend millions on shareholder gifts and nothing on upgrading worker safety? Why haven't we digitized inventory tracking like our competitors? At first, my father dismissed them with a wave of his hand. Later, he started glaring, and eventually, he just stopped answering altogether. Trevor once leaned in during a family barbecue and said, "Dad says idealism is a luxury. You should try focusing on the real world sometime." I just stared at the flames flickering in the grill and thought, no, I'm focusing on the future. You're all stuck in the past. I wasn't trying to rebel. I was trying to understand why things couldn't be better. During high school, I built a project on zero-waste factory modeling that won a state-level innovation award. My teachers were thrilled. My father called it a school science fair stunt. Trevor laughed and said, "Cute, but that's not how industrial systems work." Their contempt didn't just hurt, it fueled me. In my senior year, I was accepted into Stanford's environmental engineering program. When I announced it over dinner, the table fell silent. "Stanford?" Dad repeated, like it was a foreign word. "You've always been so strong in communication. Why not business? Why not Wharton like Trevor?" "Because I want to build things," I said. "Sustainable systems, resilient infrastructure, solutions." He stared at me like I'd insulted him. "You think you're smarter than the generations that built Kingswell?" I didn't answer. What would have been the point? I packed my bags and left for California with a backpack full of textbooks and a heart full of something I hadn't felt in years: of direction. At Stanford, I felt like I could finally breathe. The questions I asked weren't ignored, they were explored. My professors saw potential instead of problems. I met peers who believed the climate crisis wasn't just real, but solvable. And for the first time, I imagined a world where my ideas weren't laughed at, they were funded. One professor, Dr. Elise Grant, became a mentor. She told me, "The reason you see friction at home is because you're not trying to burn the system, you're trying to redesign it. That's always uncomfortable to those who benefit from the old way." I remember standing in her office that afternoon, sunlight hitting the edge of her whiteboard sketches, and realizing, maybe I wasn't broken. Maybe I just didn't belong in their version of success. But I could build my own. And maybe, just maybe, one day, they would see the future through my eyes. After Reno, everything changed. Word spread faster than I expected. One factory manager passed my name to another, and suddenly, I had meetings lined up across 3 states. Small operations, struggling with outdated infrastructure and rising energy bills, started giving Verdant Core a chance. Tasha and I moved into a co-working space in Oakland, which we shared with a dog-walking app and a VR company that never seemed to wear shoes. It was chaotic, loud, sometimes smelled like kombucha and printer ink, but it was ours. I brought in our first 2 hires: Jasper, a data systems genius with a background in mechanical engineering, and Noemi, a quiet but lethal supply chain analyst who used to work at a rival firm that had gone under due to greenwashing scandals. I couldn't pay them much, but I offered equity and a chance to actually change things. To my surprise, they said yes. Within the first year, we had contracts in 5 states. Our systems didn't just cut energy use, they made plants smarter. Adaptive scheduling, predictive maintenance, automated reporting for compliance. Clients called it magic. We called it math and mission. I still lived frugally: ramen, thrifted blazers, IKEA furniture I assembled myself. There were weeks where I chose payroll over rent, sleeping on the office couch to make ends meet. My family didn't know. I didn't want their pity or worse, their "I told you so." Every visit home was a masterclass in restraint. Dad would greet me with polite indifference. Trevor always found a way to bring up Kingswell's latest acquisition before dessert. Mom would steer the conversation to some charity gala Claire, our cousin, was organizing, always with that soft warning smile. Don't ruin the mood. At one particularly brutal dinner, Trevor turned to me and asked, "So, Madison, you still playing with climate calculators, or have you moved on to something real yet?" I smiled. "We just helped a Midwest textile plant cut emissions by 45% while increasing output by 18%. He blinked. Dad coughed into his napkin. No one said a word. But they didn't believe it mattered. In their world, anything not branded Kingswell was a hobby. An experiment. A blip. What they didn't realize was that their empire was quietly crumbling, and my little experiment was starting to look more like the future. Our client list grew. So did our confidence. Investors began to take notice, especially those focused on ESG, environmental, social, and governance, portfolios. We raised a modest seed round, just enough to expand our team and build proprietary analytics software. Still, I kept hearing the same line from my father every time we crossed paths. Real business is about legacy. Let's see if you're still around in 5 years. The irony? He wouldn't be. Not in the way he imagined. The signs were subtle at first. A news article about Kingswell losing a key contract in Arizona. A quiet leadership shakeup in their logistics division. Rumors of delayed product shipments. Industry chatter about outdated practices and regulatory misalignment. I noticed them. My father and brother? They didn't or refused to. During a quarterly board update that leaked to the press, Kingswell's profit margins had dropped by 12% year over year. The article blamed rising compliance costs and international supply chain pressure, but I knew better. Kingswell wasn't under pressure. It was being outpaced by companies like mine. At the next family gathering, I arrived to find the mood unusually tense. The usual boastful energy was gone. Dad seemed more tired than proud. Trevor was nursing a drink before noon. Still, old habits die hard. "Still hustling your little startup?" Trevor asked, his voice only half playful. I nodded. We just closed a partnership with CalClean Energy. 3-year contract, 6 facilities. Dad gave a non-committal grunt, then turned to Trevor. "Speaking of facilities, we're finalizing expansion into Texas. Kingswell's going leaner, more focused. Vertical integration is the future." I almost laughed. Vertical integration? They couldn't even integrate cloud-based systems without help from outside consultants. But I said nothing. Instead, I watched my family cling to buzzwords like life vests on a sinking ship. A few weeks later, I was contacted confidentially by one of Kingswell's mid-level engineers. Someone who had been at the company longer than I'd been alive. He told me the new Texas facility was hemorrhaging cash. Old machines, bad layout, zero automation. They'd built a monument to the past, not a blueprint for the future. I wanted to warn them. Really, I did. So I tried. I invited Dad to coffee, just the two of us. I brought charts, data, side-by-side efficiency projections, showed him how Verdant Core could reduce his operating costs by 30% in under 6 months. He barely looked up from his Americano. "Madison," he said, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but Kingswell doesn't need saving. We've lasted 70 years without your algorithms. We'll be fine." I left the cafe angry. Not at the rejection, I was used to that. No, I was angry because he couldn't even consider that his daughter might be right. In his world, admitting I had something to offer meant admitting he had been wrong all along. Meanwhile, Verdant Core kept growing. We secured a grant from the Department of Energy for our carbon reduction software, signed with a legacy food packaging company that had once been a Kingswell client. Our monthly revenue surpassed my father's first-year salary as CEO. Still, at family events, I was the passion project. The clever girl with a clever idea. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. Kingswell was on a cliff's edge, and I was building the bridge. By the middle of the 4th year at Verdant Core, I didn't have to check the news to know Kingswell was in trouble. I could see it in the silence. The industry chatter that used to revolve around Charles Blake and his bulletproof legacy had grown quieter, edged with discomfort. Vendors were pulling back. 2 key clients had signed with our competitors. I knew one of them personally because they had approached me first. What finally confirmed it was a late-night message from Richard Torres, a former Kingswell executive turned independent consultant. We'd met at a sustainability conference the year prior, where he'd half-joked, "You're building the company Kingswell should have become a decade ago." Now his tone was different. "Madison, off the record they're talking about selling. Not publicly, not yet, but things are bad. Charles is refusing all strategic pivots. Trevor's out of his depth." That night I sat in my apartment, lights dimmed, staring at an open spreadsheet of projected expansion targets for Verdant Core. One name kept floating to the top of my thoughts, no matter how much I tried to dismiss it. Kingswell. Not as a cautionary tale. As an opportunity. I tried to push the thought away. Buying your own family's company? It sounded insane, vindictive, emotional. But it also made perfect business sense. Kingswell still had real assets, manufacturing plants, distribution channels, relationships we couldn't replicate overnight. What it lacked was adaptability, vision, and technology, the very things we had built from the ground up. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was redemption. For me, for the company, maybe even for my father's legacy if he could let go long enough to see it. I floated the idea to my leadership team during our next strategy session. Tasha's jaw literally dropped. "You want to acquire Kingswell?" she said, eyes wide. "No," I corrected. "I want to save it by buying it. Quietly, cleanly, through a holding company. They'd never agree if they knew it was me." After a long silence, Jasper leaned back in his chair. "If you pull this off, this would be the full circle no one saw coming." We created Northlight Capital, our acquisition vehicle, and hired a firm to handle all front-facing communication. Verdant Core's name would be buried deep in the paperwork until the ink was dry. I couldn't sleep the night our offer was submitted. Not from nerves, from clarity. For the first time in years, I saw the future unfolding not just for us, but for Kingswell too. I wasn't here to destroy what my grandfather built. I was here to bring it back to life, reimagined for a new era. A week later, I got a call from our lawyer. "They're considering it." Quietly, but seriously. At the same time, the annual Blake family party was coming up, a lavish affair thrown every summer to celebrate legacy and leadership. I hadn't planned on attending. But now? Now, I wouldn't miss it for the world. Because that party? That would be the night everything changed. The Blake family party was exactly what I remembered. Loud, expensive, and curated to perfection. String quartet in the garden, champagne towers, white-gloved waitstaff passing hors d'oeuvres with names no one could pronounce. And of course, the patriarch himself, Charles Blake, standing near the fireplace like a general surveying his domain. When I walked in, heads turned. I wasn't wearing a power suit, just a deep green dress, simple, modern, unapologetic. I moved through the room like smoke, seen, but never expected to ignite anything. My father spotted me and raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think you'd show," he said, handing me a drink. "Still working from home?" I smiled. "Something like that." He laughed. "Well, tonight's not about side projects. Tonight, we celebrate legacy. He clinked his glass against mine. Big changes ahead. He had no idea. As the night wore on, Trevor took the stage. Of course he did. He tapped the mic and cleared his throat with theatrical precision. Thank you all for being here tonight. I have the great pleasure of announcing something monumental for our family. He paused for effect. Kingswell Industries has officially entered a new phase. We've secured a private acquisition that ensures our company's future fresh capital, expanded reach, and best of all, the Blake family remains in charge. Applause erupted. My father beamed. My mother wiped a tear. I just sipped my drink and waited. He continued. Our new partners, Northlight Capital, will provide the strategic resources to grow globally while keeping our leadership intact. That was my cue. I stepped forward. Actually, I said, voice calm but carrying, there's something you should all know about Northlight. The room turned. Trevor frowned. Madison, this really isn't the time. No, it is, I said. I turned to our guests. Northlight Capital is indeed the holding company that finalized the acquisition this morning. The paperwork was signed at 11:17 a.m. I looked directly at my father. And Northlight was created by Verdant Core Technologies, my company. As of this morning, I own Kingswell Industries. The silence hit like a thunderclap. My father's glass slipped in his hand, shattering against the marble. Trevor stared, mouth open. My mother clutched the armrest, lips parted but voiceless. You're lying, Trevor said, stepping forward. I'm not, I said evenly. You signed the deal, you just didn't know who was behind it. This is some kind of trick, my father growled. No, I replied. It's a solution. One you refuse to see over and over. I offered help. You laughed. I brought proof. You dismissed it. So I did. The only thing left. Trevor exploded. You bought your way in? Out of spite? I shook my head. Out of necessity. Kingswell was failing. You know it. I couldn't let it die. Not when I could rebuild it properly. You think you can run a company like Kingswell? My father spat. I already do, I said. Ours is more efficient, more sustainable, more profitable. I didn't come here for revenge. I came to offer a choice. I took a deep breath. You can walk away, or you can stay and help lead Kingswell into its next era. But on new terms. True collaboration. No more silencing. No more ego. My father stared at me, stone-faced. Then, without a word, he walked out. Trevor followed, slamming the French doors behind him. Only my mother remained seated, tears brimming. Why didn't you just tell us? Because you never would have listened, I whispered. You never saw me, not really. But tonight, you have to. She nodded slowly and stood, touching my cheek. You're your grandfather's fire. He would have been proud. That was the first time in my life I heard those words. The room buzzed with confusion, tension, and awe, but I was calm. For the first time, I wasn't the outsider. I wasn't the girl with impractical ideas. I was Madison Blake, owner of the very empire that once cast me aside. And now? The future was mine to write. The days following the party were a whirlwind. Headlines started circulating within hours. Startup CEO secretly acquires industrial giant. Kingswell under new ownership from within the Blake family. Internally, the transition wasn't easy. Some longtime Kingswell employees were skeptical, others were openly resistant. I expected that. You don't modernize a 70-year-old company without shaking the foundation a little. But what I didn't expect was the silence from my father. No calls, no emails, not even a denial statement to the press. Trevor, on the other hand, went straight into combat mode, hiring lawyers to look into loopholes, hoping to invalidate the sale, but he came up empty. The acquisition had been clean, by the book, and fully approved by the board. Eventually, he backed off. What surprised me most was my mother. She invited me to lunch 2 weeks after the takeover, no agenda, just curiosity. As we sat by the window of her favorite cafe, she reached across the table and said, "You really did it." I nodded. I had to. She looked down at her tea. You know, Your grandfather built Kingswell with his bare hands. Your father built its reputation. But you might be the one who gives it a future. I didn't know how to respond. I just breathed. Back at Verdant Core, now merged with Kingswell's operations, our team moved quickly. We started with the worst performing facility in Texas. Within 3 months, we reduced energy waste by 37% and brought the plant into full regulatory compliance. It was a beginning. I offered my father a role as chair of legacy relations, an honorary but functional position focused on preserving long-term partnerships and institutional knowledge. He declined, politely but firmly. I built this company to lead it, he said, finally calling me, not to answer to my daughter. I'm not asking you to answer to me, I replied. I'm asking you to walk beside me. That's the difference. He didn't respond. But a month later, he sent me a book, a worn hardcover biography of industrialist Ray Anderson. Inside, a note in his tight handwriting. Sustainability isn't the enemy of business. I see that now. You were ahead of us all. Dad. I kept that note in my desk drawer. Today, Kingswell is something new, a hybrid, a bridge between legacy and vision. Our employee retention has gone up, our emissions have gone down, and our profits? The best in company history. But none of that compares to this. When I walk into the headquarters, the one that once had no place for me, I'm not just welcomed, I'm respected. And more than that, I'm finally heard. Because sometimes, rewriting a legacy doesn't mean burning it down. It just means daring to imagine it better.